Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Kvetching with Adam and Jared. It's us. We're not going to introduce ourselves again. As I suggested last time, we're not going to go down the Larry, Daryl, and Daryl route. Today, we have a guest. I think it's our first guest of 2024 that we've had on. And we are very excited to have Lee with us here. We've booked her over a month ago. I guess she's in high demand across the country. And we're thrilled to have her with her tonight. I should add, viewers, that there is a major storm where I live at the moment, including a tornado warning about an hour ago. So if I suddenly disappear, it's not that Adam has canceled me. It means that it's not that bad. It just means I might have gotten swept away.
Although that might happen too. So
yeah. But it just might be a tornado. It might not be cancellation or anything, which these days cancellation can be far worse. So we're going to let Lee introduce herself, and then we will let Lee tell her story, and we will take it from there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jared and Adam, for having me on. What a great opportunity to connect with you. I'm a lifelong educator. I've been teaching for as long as I've been learning. I sometimes joke because, I was used as a peer tutor in my elementary education times. But of course, I got some formal education under my belt and became a teacher. I taught in East Los Angeles public middle schools for about 10 years. There, I developed civic education programs, and I taught gifted English language learners history, social studies, and English. And at that same time, I was working as a teacher, trainer, PD developer, mostly around technology, helping teachers understand giftedness as neurodiversity, and topics like that. How do we improve our craft as a teacher? So faculty support, teacher training and support is something I've always done. And I think how we all crossed paths was one of my recent positions where I finally broke through the higher education hiring racket, if you will, and I landed a full-time tenure track position, which was my goal when I got my doctorate in education some years before that. I spent many years working as an adjunct teacher because I just couldn't get my foot in the door. But during the pandemic, one of the silver linings for me was there were some openings for faculty support, as everyone tried to shift online, and teachers were panicking and they had never taught online. And I had been in this sphere since I was in my teens. So my first stint was as an instructional designer. That was a temporary one-year position. And then the second position that I landed when that temporary one ended was a faculty director for the Office of Equity, Social Justice, and Multicultural Education at Anza College. It's a community college. And I started there in 2021. And that is the position that propelled me to national attention. That wasn't the way I wanted to become nationally recognized, but
such are the realities of academia today. Yeah, we don't
yes.
all the attention we're seeking.
Yeah, that wasn't what I was seeking at all, but I had some choices to make, as I was experiencing this intense environment of bullying and harassment and intimidation and just unprofessionalism. I had a choice to either resign and then, pretend that all never happened, which is what one of my mentors told me. You just resign, you pretend that never happened, don't put it on your resume, and you go on. Or I could shine a light so other people could see. And I saw that the conditions where I had worked were so terrible and deplorable that I had a duty to speak up. And not just disappear and, resign and allow these people to do this to someone else, when they came into the position.
For those that are not necessarily familiar with you.
Oh, no, we want you to tell the whole story, but just a quick question though. Well, first of all, just a quick announcement. I just received another tornado warning, so I do need to keep my phone on. So I am under tornado alerts. Second, were you tenured yet when this happened?
So no, I was tenure track. So started in 2021.
So tell your story. Let's hear your story.
Yes. Well, pretty much from the beginning. So I started off by doing needs assessment conversations. I'm an inquiry-based approach person. And so I did needs assessment conversations to see what were the needs people saw on the ground and, what was the status of this office and what did they think the school needed to best serve their students. And during those conversations, multiple things were mentioned over and over again. And so it became a pattern. There was talk of not a lot of us talking to each other. We talk about each other. There were some issues with anti-Semitism raised. It's pointed out to me multiple times that our campus and the district had began academic calendars on Jewish high holy holidays for like 4 decades.
Yeah.
And that people had even written to the ADL and had letters from the ADL sent to the school saying, please, you can't do this. But yet they continued. And each time the ball will be shifted, like, oh, it's the teachers union's fault because they said it. Oh, it's the administration's fault. So no one could ever get to who makes that decision. And I noticed that was a pattern. And then not only that, as I started to reach out to community partners and talk to them, I heard issues of our student government they were concerned about, who had taken several made resolutions to condemn Israel. They had also advanced some BDS resolutions. And the Jewish Student Union, which I guess we had at one time in that district, had brought forth, they wanted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism to be adopted. And when they did that, they were shouted down on the floor of the Student Senate. They were harassed. They were told, that no one wanted to do that. And what the student government did, according to what people recounted to me, was they ended up not adopting any definition and then making a resolution to condemn Israel. So it was like the opposite of what the students themselves were seeking. And so I knew there was something there and some questions there. And I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole would go, though. As I started to do my work, I was seated as this faculty director on what was called the Equity Action Council. And I was supposed to, again, help try to transform the campus to be more inclusive. That was my role on that. And some of the community leaders came to the Equity Action Council and they pointed out, all of the things I just told you about, the resolutions, how the students felt hurt, how there had been flyers dropped across the campus, like multiple instances over the years of anti-Semitism on campus. And they said, this campus is not safe for Jewish students. So this is back in 2021. So this is pre, many things that we've seen happen since
How
that
many
time.
Jewish students are there on your campus? Are there a fair number?
I don't know if they ever had that on their count. So when they do their counts of students, they count things like Latinx and Philippines and other racial categories that they've invented, but they don't count things like Jewish
It's
or,
because we're defined as a religion in this country, and you're not allowed to ask people about their religious affiliation. Right. I mean,
right. So yeah, and maybe that's the reason. But they had a whole bunch of other things that they invented that they categorized students by and tracked data on. And so that wasn't a concern of theirs at all. But when these individuals brought this to the Equity Action Council, they pointed out that we had like a website where it said like Black Lives Matter and Asian stop AAPI hate and we stand against racism and hate and all of these things, but they didn't mention anti-Semitism at all or standing with the Jewish community. And they said, would you all please just add a little section to your website where you have all these, other banners and causes and say that you stand against anti-Semitism. And it was that response from my supervising dean and my fellow workers in my office that really let me know just how deeply entrenched the anti-Semitism was. Because when we took it back to talk as a team, I said, what are we going to do about this? They gave us written recommendations. They didn't just come talk. And while they were talking, though, one of the staff members was dropping what they called resources into the chat, into the Zoom chat. And they said, another good resource to look at is Jewish Voice for Peace. Another good resource to look at is Students for Justice for Palestine.
Oh my God.
And I found that to be very rude to the speakers who were speaking. Who came to speak to us, and they were giving us resources like, how do we talk about anti-Semitism in the classroom? How do you support Jewish students? Things of that nature is what the speakers were giving us. And I said, that was really rude when our speakers were addressing us for you to be dropping those resources, which were antithetical to what they were talking about. And it was antagonizing, I found it. And I was told, well, it's not antagonizing. You had a right to say what you were saying, and they said what they were saying, and we were giving resources that we thought were appropriate. I said, okay, fine. Right, that's free speech, free expression. They can share their resources. I just found it to be very rude. So I did express that, and that was the response I got. So I just left that one at academic freedom,
Do you
freedom of
think they
expression.
knew those sources? I mean, it should be obvious that Students for Justice in Palestine wouldn't be a good source for exploring anti-Semitism, but Jewish Voice for Peace, I mean, they masquerade as this pro-Jewish organization, but they're actually worse than Students for Justice in Palestine in many respects. Do you think
Oh yeah, they actually coordinate a lot with each other, and they support efforts on campus, anti-Semitic efforts on campus, even though the name, right, you would think that it's representative. They're a fringe organization, and frankly, I think they're a domestic terrorist organization from what I have seen and experienced from some of their members.
Agreed.
So, you know, that's why, but that all happened after, right? The initial things. And so I said, what are we going to do about these recommendations? And I was told we weren't going to do anything. And it wasn't important to address this because there's no reports of anti-Semitism in the student reporting system. You know, they have an online, if you experience discrimination or this or that, you report. So there's no reports of it, so it doesn't exist here. And I recounted my numerous needs assessment conversations. I recounted what I saw and experienced and how I felt in the meeting even with them. And I said, you know, our board just made a resolution saying we condemn anti-Semitism as a district. They didn't define it. They just made this blanket statement. So I said, you don't feel a need for us to act even based on what the Board of Trustees is saying? And the answer was no. I was told that Jews are white oppressors and we're focused on decentering whiteness. And when I heard that, I was just so shocked. I had never encountered a viewpoint like that in my 40 years of teaching and learning. And I said, how can you say Jews are white oppressors, are white, Jews are white? That flies in the face of the diaspora, the diversity of the diaspora of Jewish people. And, you know, it's just, it doesn't line up with the numbers. Like, where are you even getting that from? And they would never state to me where they were getting that categorization from, where they were even coming up with this idea. But just the fact that I pushed back made them treat me as an inside enemy because I wasn't seeing it the same way as them, even though they couldn't, you know, if they really wanted to educate me, they could have given me the sources like I asked for. You know, when I said, who told you that? Or where did that come from? I've never heard that. They couldn't counter it with anything, but that's just the way it is. And so
you have these Jews on your campus who have never done anything to anyone. They're experiencing anti-Semitism, and those kids are being called white oppressors. So it's not even a matter of them being just in a group that includes perhaps white oppressors. That in and of itself, I would challenge. But let's assume that maybe the Jews are white oppressors. These Jews here on campus have not oppressed anyone. How do they get around that?
Okay, well, I don't think Jews are white oppressors, but let's leave open
Yeah.
the possibility that we Ashkenazi Jews might be white, at least according to the American.
Yeah, let's assume for a second.
Yeah, no, the point is that this, you haven't mentioned Israel once. So this really isn't at the end of the day about Israel, right? It's not attacking these students for being Zionists. It's actually
so let me just I'll like quick short it for you all. I ended up bringing, because I saw there was a certain viewpoint in place, and I had never heard of it before. So I went to the sources that I had always used as a teacher and as a learner. You know, I always knew about Hillel. I knew that was a on-campus group that helps Jewish students. You know, they do Shabbat with them, all of these things. So I went to the local Hillel. You know, I reached out to them. I reached out to other organizations that I had previously, like I mentioned, worked with, saw the work, thought it was good work. And I ended up arranging a Jewish education, what was it? Jewish Inclusion and Anti-Semitism Education Summit. I brought in speakers, this went on for 5 weeks. My supervising dean would not give me a budget for it, so I literally had to ask people to please, would they volunteer their time, and they did, luckily. I had people from the Brandeis Center for Human Rights. We brought in Tammy Rossman Benjamin from Anza Initiative. Yes.
And the people on the left consider them to be, you know, very, very far right.
Right.
I'm not saying my opinion. I'm just saying what the left says.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm far right according to the left.
But I found their perspectives to be ones that were needed on the campus, because there was only one perspective being advanced so far prior to that. And that was one that was anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish, and just a terrible environment for the students. That's why we don't have even a Jewish student club anymore. So that's how hostile the environment has become on that campus.
Wow.
So I was looking to bring perspectives that maybe people hadn't heard before. So they could learn about things. So they could learn about Natan Sharansky and, you know, the 3Ds and what is anti-Semitism, because it seemed like people didn't. I was coming from the perspective like maybe people just don't know. And they just need some frameworks and understandings to help them to engage in a more positive way. And what happened with that, it wasn't promoted to the students. It went on the calendar, but it didn't get pushed out. And so we had very low attendance, and faculty didn't attend, senior leadership didn't attend, you know, and so we were doing these workshops and activities and so forth, but it was such low attendance. About 2 weeks after our 5-week summit ended, there was an event organized by, they called it the Progressive Student Union. I had never heard of this group. They had done nothing prior to that in the time that I had been there. And they invited people in the titles that had things like anti-Zionist activist, anti-Israel community organizer, Jewish Voice for Peace representative. And they pushed this out to the students. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with the online learning, but Canvas or other learning management systems, when you log in, it'll pop up messages if your campus sends it out. Well, this
Luckily, our
was a
campus doesn't
pop-up.
do that, but oh, where's
Yeah, this was all during the pandemic for us. We were under lockdown here in California, so we're all online. So this would pop up for students when they logged in to come to this with these speakers, these panelists from the Progressive Student Union. And that was deeply offensive as well, because it showed the upper leadership of the school was promoting and prioritizing this to students, but not the other opportunities to learn. And so I was called a dirty Zionist. I was called the B word, you know, all kinds of just terrible things from these individuals. And it was truly heartbreaking for me
So if
as
there
a
was a
teacher.
concerted effort to actually discourage students from attending those programs?
When you don't promote it or put it out on Canvas like you did other things, you know, shortly thereafter, to me, it shows an unequal promotion of ideas. And it's not that no one knew that it was happening. I'm sending it to the communications manager, you know, same way you would, the Progressive Student Union would have sent their things out to be publicized well in
Did
advance.
they give you an explanation for why Jews are white oppressors? Did they define that?
No, they didn't define that, Jared. They couldn't define that. They couldn't define equity. They couldn't define diversity. And some of my early workshops were around doing just that. And I was told that by holding those workshops, I was leading people to danger, and I was inappropriate. I shouldn't be doing that. And I would say, well, we all need a common definition. We're saying these words and we're all meaning different things. We need to come together, right, across the different perspectives and get something that we can all stand behind to serve our students. And that was from the needs assessment conversations too. They told me we have this long history here of being activists and, you know, making change in the world, but our equity scores have been flatlining for like 20 years. There's been no progress. And it's
By
because
that
we're
they
all
mean that there's no quote diversity on campus, right? That's what they're suggesting.
right. That's what they're saying. And they're saying that, and they said it's the reason that was, you know, given for many people was we're all meaning different things. So that's why I initially was doing these
Well,
definitions.
they don't see the college as a place for intellectual learning and sharing ideas and critical thinking. They seem to see it just as a place where a dogmatic narrative is being pushed, and that's it. And you
That's
threaten.
what,
But you were
yeah.
hired to do DEI related work, right? I mean, that was part of
No, I was hired to lead, so the job description said to lead a campus-wide transformation around the topics of diversity, of social, so my office was equity, social justice, and multicultural education. So
Mhm.
around those 3 areas. And to, you know, look at the anti-racist initiatives that were coming down from the chancellor's office, the community college chancellor's office. In California, they've done something very unique in that the chancellor has the chancellor's office of the whole 119 college system has basically demanded that ideological approaches be taken in the classroom and that faculty be evaluated based on them. So there's been some legal challenges to that recently, which I'm very glad some of the other
When you say
faculty
system,
members,
do you mean community college system, state
the
community?
entire community college, yeah, publicly funded. And the thing is, they're saying you must be anti-racist, but they've never disclosed which anti-racist approach they're using. But when you look in their reference list, you see certain authors like Ibram Kendi and others. And so that's telling you. So what part of my work, again, I wanted to understand who was around me, where were these people coming from, and I wanted others to understand it. So I started to, really try to classify and better understand what were the race ideologies that could be used in an anti-racist approach. And I started teaching about that. And again, I was chastised. I was told that that wasn't okay to do. So if we're doing like what Adam said, teaching people to think critically, and critical thinking is part of the master educational plan for California community colleges. It's one of the competencies. But I was told that, I wasn't allowed to do that. That wasn't what they wanted me to do. And I would say, well, give me some, objectives or things. Tell me exactly what you're wanting me to do. And they wouldn't do that either. It was just, you're not doing what we want. And we're not going to tell you what we want, because you're just not doing it. Was just this, it was like a catch-22. And I'm someone who I work really well, when I have clear objectives in place, and someone's clear about what they're asking me to do. When you say, wholesale, go ahead and, do your work as you always have as an educational consultant, and, and so forth, then I start to use those tools, and I do needs assessments. And then from that, I develop a work plan, that I follow. And that's exactly what I did. I was fully transparent, but from the beginning, it was not welcomed.
Wow.
So where does this arrive?
Did they police speech in the classroom when you said they wanted people to teach ideologically?
Oh, yes. So in my last year, they got rid of what used to be called the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Center, and they combined it with what they call the Pride Office. And that was a new office that opened in the this past academic year, when I was terminated. And immediately, the person who came in as a director of that held several sessions where they kind of used student voice to advance an agenda where they were saying everyone on campus should have their pronouns in their email signature and on their syllabus. And you should say your pronouns and encourage your students to say your pronouns so that everyone feels safe and welcome. And I raised my hand. I said, it sounds like we're talking about compelled speech. And that's concerning for me. Because no one should be compelled, to do anything. And I would rather, as an equity, director, have our faculty know students' names before they know their sexualities and their purported genders. And again, that labeled me a pariah because I wasn't going along with the program. So what I discovered after all of this, it kind of during and after, was, this ideology that I call it a critical social justice ideology. And it makes race and gender the focus of every single interaction. Whatever your race and gender checkboxes are, that's the focus of everything. If there's some kind of disparity, it's related to those boxes, and we need to be more open. That's the kind of, there's oppressed and victims. That's the kind of ideology that was being pushed throughout the school.
And if you can't check off any boxes, you're an oppressor, right? I mean, it's all
right.
It's like they basically took the racism and misogyny that existed in Western civilization for centuries, and they threw out the whole civil rights thing and they've inverted it. They've instituted a racialist and gender biased system, but in favor of the groups that used to be the ones who were, victimized, something that obviously needed to be corrected. But this is a return to racialization in many respects.
In many respects, and there were many things that happened on campus, like the racial affinity groups. I just, again, raised questions about it. Why were we suddenly considering giving these? There was only 3 at that time affinity groups. So they weren't even representative. If you're going to do these groups, these tribal groups, then every group should have representative, right?
What's an affinity group?
So a racial affinity group would be like they had the Latinx Association. It's Latinx, but I say Latinx because that's how it's pronounced. It's not part of the Spanish language. It's this invention of critical social justice warriors.
Most Latinos that I know utterly reject the term.
Yes. And as I mentioned to you, I taught in East LA public middle schools for 10 years. So when I encountered this at where I was teaching in that district in the California Community College, I went back and I asked some of my former students and even colleagues, and I was like, have you heard this? And I grew up in the Central Valley, California, which is a high, I think we have the largest population of Filipino Americans. And I went to them, I said, have you heard this Philippinks? Is anyone using this? They said, what? They said, we absolutely not. Who's telling you that? I said, well, I'm at this college now. And that's what they're telling students to call themselves. And they're renaming the data from the state and calling it that because it's not coming from the state that way. So they actually take the time to rename it and put an X there. And they said, absolutely not. Don't ever use that with us. Don't, that's offensive. You know, we're Filipino. I was actually told our language is already gender inclusive. You don't need to do the extra, you know? So I was like, okay. So I was even more emboldened to find out, how did this start here? So I started asking questions like that. Why did we start using Latinx and Philippines? Where did it come from? Nobody could tell me, but just we're all doing it. So it was this constant environment of people just suddenly starting to do something. It couldn't be traced back. So I'm a historian, social studies type person. So I need to know where this came from to understand it. And
That
each time
was my question before Jerry interrupted me.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Where all
Fetch
this
away, Adam. Go and fetch. Come on.
where does it derive, right? Is this just a big group think?
that's what I could determine. No, I still never got the answer, Adam. When I asked, was it senior leadership? Who made this change? Just one day, we all were told to do it. And that's what someone told me in a needs assessment conversation. Now, that same person, when I started to challenge it openly, they would never speak up. And I'm not going to out them, right? They told me that in confidence. So I never outed anyone, but it was so strange to me. It was like being in an alternative universe because people would come and tell me things in private. But then when we would be in a group setting, one person would speak and they say, we don't do that, or we don't believe that. And everyone else will be quiet. And I would kind of say, well, what does someone else think? Or, you know, try to get some other perspectives in. And everyone else, when the one person spoke, they spoke for all. So it was this atmosphere constantly of that. When they were talking about giving these racial affinity groups voting rights in the academic senate, I raised questions of, it could this be considered discriminatory by, you know, the Title IX codes and all that? Is that right to do? We only have 3 affinity groups. They're not representative of everyone. And even the groups we have, a lot of people weren't involved in them because they were the really, quote, woke people that were in those groups. And some of the people on campus were not woke. I mean, that's from the beginning. People would tell me, you know, like, I don't go to your office, the Office of Equity, because the office is too woke and they make me feel uncomfortable as a faculty member. I was told multiple times, even in the interview process, that was told to me. So, you know, I was doing the work as I had always done it, trying to bring in everyone. And I had actually started bringing in people who hadn't previously interacted because they saw, you know, what I was doing and that I was trying to bring people together and get some points of commonality. And they appreciated that. And that just made the people who were leading my tenure review committee even more angry. They said I wasn't working with who I was supposed to work with. And I'm like, well, who am I supposed to work with? It's a campus-wide position.
Yeah.
You know, I'm bringing in people who've never been involved before. What's wrong with that? And they,
Well,
and they were
I
like,
graduated from Berkeley in 2008 with my PhD, and it hadn't taken over yet. I don't think I ever heard the word Latinx once when I was there. Now, you know, my PhD is in Russian and Jewish history. Jewish studies was already a complete wreck at that point. Hostile, anti-Zionist. You know, I knew to keep away from them, even though I did Jewish stuff. I had one advisor from Jewish studies. He was a historian. I hung out with the Russian historians. They're by far more rational people. They just want to study history. The war in Ukraine, they're still not obsessing over decolonization and blah, blah, blah. I mean, they're, you know, they're discussing it in their research as they should, but they're not suddenly becoming activists trying to dismantle, you know, the very sound of the Russian language that they might hear in their spaces. So
The problem with the groupthink hypothesis is that you normally, when there's groupthink, when somebody comes along and says something differently and tries to move the group into a different direction, that is often, or very often, a way of getting the group to snap out of it, to snap out of this daze that they're in. But that doesn't seem to be happening because the more that you push, the more they become even more protective of their narrative. It's almost like it's some kind of collective insanity.
Yes, yes, but I will give some credit here, Adam, because I wasn't working in a vacuum. Even though I wasn't working with the people I was supposed to be working with, others came to me, and we actually did workshops together, and we had a Heritage Month work group that we established, that was campus wide. But the people who would work with me were part-time people. None of the full time. So there, if you, I mean, there's a disproportionate representation. There's more part-time than full-time people, but they're not being paid the way they should be. And the sad thing about that is, one of the part-time people who was a strong ally with me, we really wanted to get that academic calendar fixed, and we wanted the starting on Jewish holy holidays to stop. And this was a Jewish individual, was at the same time I was terminated, targeted, and told that they were racist, and they were terminated after 40 years of service to the district, because part-time they can just be terminated for no reason. And that's exactly what happened. The other person was close to retirement, and had, again, 40 years in, they'd been there, seen it inside out, and they worked with me as well. And they would often tell me, it doesn't matter what people are saying. I have the highest seniority in my department because I've been here so long, and I'm not doing anything wrong. We're just talking about authentic inclusion. So I did have faculty partners, but again, all part-time. And I had students who were working with me, and we even had our student government pass a resolution supporting our work around the Heritage Months. So I was able to, against great adversity, for the first time, recognize Native American Heritage Month, Jewish American Heritage Month, Sikh Awareness and Appreciation Month, and also Arab American Heritage Month. And I was doing that again. We only celebrated 2 Heritage Months. And that was, there's all these federally established Heritage Months.
And those
So
would have been Black and Latino, I'm assuming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that was it. And it was as though we were pretending that no other members of the community existed. And so I wanted to, that was again a way to educate, to bring those months in, then you can have activities around it. So I was trying to develop a vision, and put that out. And the students passed the resolution saying, we need this here. And we don't learn about other cultures. We support the work you're doing. So again, no financial support. I had no budget, even though I was a director. I never knew what my budget was. Even when they were spending money on, bringing Alicia Garza to the campus, and under my office name, and I was accused of disrespecting her. She's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And so all these things, the shenanigans happened. And I always just kept it professional. I'm just a professional at heart. I can work with people who are different from me, who have different perspectives. None of that bothers me, but they weren't willing to let me do my work that I needed to do. Instead it became an issue of censoring me actively. Yeah. It became an issue of, making sure that my voice wasn't heard, excluding me, undermining my leadership, doing all sorts of things of that nature, and just acting like gangsters. That's the way I summarize it.
This is cancel culture. This is cancel culture in action that's coming from the academic realm, and the people on the left, or even some liberals, claim it doesn't really exist. Now, I have just one point, and then I want to ask you the $1 million question here. This whole classification system, it's very, it's obscene. As I suggested, it harks back to 19th century racial science. In many ways, it does come out of the Enlightenment. There was an obsession with classifying, just as there was with the animal kingdom, there was with the humanity as well. And in the American context, doing so might work with African Americans, given the history of slavery and Jim Crow. But once you start breeding all these other groups, and this is a culturally rich country, because it's a country based on immigration of persecuted peoples, whatever their skin color might be. Once you start trying to classify them, you have a big problem. And you're going to have to fit them into boxes where they're not actually going to necessarily fit. And you're going to have to figure out if they're in one of the oppressor boxes or one of the victim boxes. And then they're going to be responsible for the identity of the entire collective, right? It's something that we should be working against, in my opinion, right? Not that we shouldn't celebrate diversity and find ways to get diverse voices heard, but we need to re-emphasize the treating a person, as you suggested, get to know the person before you ask them the pronouns. right? I mean, it's
Yeah, and that was another thing I got in trouble for. I don't know if you're familiar with the with the work of Dr. Sheena Mason around racelessness. So she's advancing this idea of racelessness. And she tells us that, you know, we focus on race, but the problem is racism. And the reason why racism is a problem is because race was created to prop up racism. And so I wanted to bring that perspective. Again, it's another perspective about race. And I wanted to let people know there's other ways to view this. And so I was told that, again, I was leading people to danger by even engaging Sheena Mason. When I wanted to bring her to campus, the supervising dean refused to fund it. My supporting staff told me they would not participate in it. They wanted nothing to do with that. Did they see who she was citing and what her work was talking about? So they never even knew what she was or what she stood for. They just heard racelessness and said, oh my gosh, this is Lee, you know, being evil again, leading people to danger. And in when we got Sheena Mason there, this was the beautiful part. She came, this was in person. So this was the beginning of 22-23, this past academic year. For the fall workshops, I got it approved, even though my dean tried to, you know, torpedo that. It was approved. And we brought Dr. Mason in person, and we had the faculty there, and even some of my staff was there. And one of the questions that one of the people asked at the end was, you know, you're talking about getting rid of race. Like that means that we would no longer have it. And they said, what would we do without race? And I did that is the clip.
we'd be
That is the
individuals. How about
yes.
that?
And that's how she answered. And then that was deemed deeply offensive. You know, we need the race. So it shows you these ideologues, they need race, they need gender identity. Without those things, the whole thing crumbles. And, you know,
Yeah,
and we have
yeah.
our demographics are changing. Look at the census. There's more multiracial people that aren't checking just one box, that can't, you know. In today's world, the concept and the construct itself is outdated from many perspectives and not useful and actually constricting when we need to categorize people and think of them as these boxes instead of as individuals with unique experiences. And that's what Dr. Sheena Mason talks about in her work. And it was just so eye-opening to me because as someone who's been in this field for many years, no one had ever told me there's a different way to view race. So when I encountered her saying that and the way she did it, she wasn't, you know, being dogmatic or anything. And I'm like, this is the way I teach. I want people to know there's different ideas. So I wanted to bring that experience to people. I wrestled with that, you know, because I've been taught one thing all my life: race is real. It's present. It's in everything. And she was saying, no, race is not real. She's a skeptical eliminativist. So she says it's not real and it should be eliminated. It's not a real construct.
Yeah, I mean, it's a historically and culturally constructed category. And
Yeah.
obviously, even though it's constructed, it's had fundamental impact on, you know, who wins and who loses.
Right.
Different ways at
I
different
think
moments.
Ayn Rand, I'm not necessarily a big fan of Ayn Rand, but she was right when she said that the smallest minority is the individual.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I mean, so it's fine. It's culturally constructed. And the problem is, as a historian, what I see, and this is what things like the 1619 Project are doing, and this is just so flagrantly offensive to a historian, is they're taking what they claim is a very rigid category, and they're using it as the one explanatory variable that moves history forward. And then obviously that doesn't work. It's anachronistic in many respects. And then you get to things like the American Revolution. It says, okay, well, race has to be the cause of this. And then they end up starting to basically make up stuff because they need to center race in a way that it wasn't centered. Obviously, it was central for the Civil War, but it wasn't for the American Revolution. I mean, it was there in the background, but it wasn't the principal thing. But
yeah, we need to revise history though to fit the narrative.
Absolutely. It's
and that's
very
the problem
Soviet.
with
It's what the Russians. It's what the Russians did with class. It's no different.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to link back to that, Jared, because, you know, in the ethnic studies programs that are being advanced, and here in California, they're trying to make it a requirement to graduate to take one of these classes, and they use what's called the liberated ethnic studies model. I don't know if you've heard of it or are familiar with it, but
I've been following it, yeah.
A critical social justice framework to understand, you know, different experiences of racially minoritized people. And there's only one model being advanced, and they've actually legislated it into into California law that is the model that will be used. And so that's part of my work that I'm doing now as a director of Coalition for Empowered Education is developing an alternative model to ethnic studies. So that, you know, because it's not just in California, it's in New York, it's all the places. They're really working hard at like ramming this through for our K through 12 and higher ed students. So if people are listening, it's things like American studies, Latino studies, Native American studies, Black studies. Like there are all these things called gender studies. They all fall under this studies banner. And usually when you're looking at a class of that nature, they are using a critical social justice framework to understand things. It's anti-American most times, anti-capitalist, you know, and it has an agenda behind it, and it rewrites history. It's revisionist in nature. They don't care about historical facts or true indigeneity. Like it doesn't matter to them. They rewrite the things to fit this victim oppressor mindset, a worldview that they're trying to advance through.
No, it's crazy. Huh? Just because the Europeans happen to be the ones who ended up on top in the late modern period of history doesn't mean it was always that way, right? I mean, these people weren't eternal victims, and that's the way they are trying to sell these things, and it's absurd.
It's a religion. It's not intellectual point of view. It's a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the $1 million question here to come back. Yep. We are a Jewish podcast after all, but okay. So and you've noticed, and I read your article again today, and I've seen some of the tweets you inserted there. Obviously, you've noticed this. I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter Chicago tweets in particular, which is one of the most offensive things as a Jew that I've ever seen in my life, and really any human should be offended by that. Why has, shorthand speaking here, the woke centered anti-Zionism and the liberation of Palestine in the way that they have? It's the only foreign conflict that seems relevant to what is otherwise a domestic agenda. And this obviously leads into anti-Semitism, but without getting to the whole, is this anti-Semitic or just anti-Zionist debate, why is the liberation of Palestine so crucial? What does it have to do with Black Lives Matter Chicago? Why do they need a banner celebrating people who decapitated 1,200 Jews? I mean, why would they even want to do that? It's nuts. When Jews have historically, wanted to help the liberation of Black people.
Yeah, I think you touched on many points there, Jared, and it is the $1 million question. I would say that the problem is the result of people not understanding anti-Semitism itself and allowing people to advance this idea that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. Okay, I am someone who I believe, and I have seen, and I've turned on my CNN and Fox and Newsmax and MSNBC, and I see the people marching in the streets and what they're saying, some of the same slogans that were shouted at students in 2021 at Anza. And this whole sector of people within the Jewish and Black communities who have equivocated on this issue for too long and said, oh no, anti-Zionism separate from anti-Semitism. Like they're not the same. You can be anti-Zionist, but not anti-Semitic. To me, they are one and the same. I use a clip from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, where he outlines how anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. That's what he said at that time. We're seeing it. And I think people who didn't want to accept that and wanted to separate things, have for a long time confused the issue.
If they're defining Jews as white oppressors, and they're talking about Israel, then for them, Zionism is Judaism. Therefore, being anti-Israel is being anti-Semitic.
And we're hyper-white, as another scholar put it. We've managed to insert ourselves into white supremacy in a way where our group identity is still preserved and perhaps we're even controlling things, but we are upholding a white supremacist system. This is really the inversion, minus the biological aspects of it. It's the inversion of what the Nazis were saying. It's the same idea, right? The Jews, communism and other ideas to prop up their power.
It's the same idea. And if you look back to the United Nations, where they called, stated Zionism as racism, that's the same vein of thought that's been there from the beginning. And
every form of nationalism is racism in certain ways, right? I mean, again, it's either they all are or they're not.
I support the right of the Jewish people to self-determine and to,
Oh, as do I. I'm just
right.
suggesting
So
that the way they're using the word race, if you're going to apply it to Zionism, you have to apply it to every nationalist ideology because they're all claiming their ancestral territory.
right.
As opposed to the other people there, let's say Serbs and Croats. We were here before you, Croats,
Yep.
therefore it's ours.
It
You
applies to
consider that
everyone. It's
racist?
okay for
Maybe
everyone
you,
but Israel. That's the
yeah,
thing.
that's
And
the
that's the
problem.
anti-Semitism
Yeah,
rearing
yeah.
its head again. It's
Double
been for
standard.
thousands of years, and it's just continuing now into today's world, and advancing this to the students and teaching them that this is the truth. Teaching them the wrong facts about who is indigenous to the land of Judea is toxic. It's destroying the minds of people. I love these clips that I've seen, Jared, where they go out into these protests and they say, from the river to the sea. One person was saying from the valleys to the mountain. Like, they don't even know. They couldn't tell you what river, what sea. They don't even know what they're talking about a lot of time. But there are some who very much know. And what they mean and what they're calling for is genocide. I reject this whole, it's aspirational call. What Rashida Tlaib or one of these people said that, and that's not an aspirational call. You're calling for genocide. It's like everything is being inverted. Exactly like you said, Jared. And it's intentional. It's an intentional inversion of language, of understanding of the world, of history, revision and inversion. And this victim mindset, they feel emboldened to do it. And that's it just makes me sick. It makes me sick to see the talks. I saw a Hamas leader on it was being translated. I'm not an Arabic speaker, but there's been verifications of the translation that I found to be trustworthy. And he said, October 7th was just the beginning. We will do this again and again, and it's okay because we are the victims. And so you hear Hamas saying that, and that's their perspective. We're the victims. Anything we do is okay. And the people who are out there rallying and supporting this, that's how they feel. They genuinely feel that it's okay because they're quote freedom fighters, not terrorists. So
what frightens me are so many of these Americans, especially in Gen Z, that are identifying with Hamas, that read Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people. This was something that happened a couple of months ago. And they were coming out on TikTok, amazed by how much clarity is found in that letter. It's amazing. Yeah. What is going on? They're being brainwashed by who?
Well, this is what they're learning in their classrooms, they're definitely learning that, this is the perspective. They should stand in solidarity, with certain populations. I was even as I worked in my capacity in the California Community College system, they brought in a quote anti-racist program for the athletes. And we ended up at the end, they were telling the athletes to be someone who supports social justice, you need to take a knee when you go out. Don't say the pledge and all these things. And I'm like, what does that have to do with being an athlete, and being a competitor in a competitive sport? Why are they even talking about those things? And I actually raised the student awareness about that and showed them how, basically one perspective about race was being advanced to them and no other perspective was being taught. And again, I was pegged as, being problematic for doing that. You don't have to take a knee or do certain things to, be a fair-minded person. You don't have to do what Black Lives Matter Global Foundation tells you need to do.
Yeah, this country's founded on, in part, on the premise that you have the right to protest, but you can't compel other people to protest. I mean, it just flies in the face of what freedom is supposed to mean here. It's
right.
Yeah, no, so it's really the whole why they've centered Palestine. I know in practice the way it seems to work, and you have to do this by looking at the universities that aren't the big R1 or the liberal arts colleges. Is what ends up happening is you have people involved in DEI and social justice, and they're predominantly focused on domestic stuff, African Americans and immigration and whatever not. But then Students for Justice in Palestine comes and opens up shop, and then they ends up telling them that you really need to center Palestine in your cause, and they buy into it, and and then the next thing you know, suddenly Palestine is one of the most important issue that they're putting forth, or conspicuously the only foreign issue. And as you said at the beginning, that hate against Israel is just a new form of anti-Semitism. that very much is true to a certain extent. I mean, in theory, I guess it's impossible to be an anti-Zionist if you reject all nationalisms, period. There should be no ethnic nation states. If that's your belief, then okay, you're not subjecting Israel to a double standard. But the point is, these people are subjecting them to them. The other thing is, when they start describing Zionism as, quote, a global threat, as that law school speaker did last year, that's mathematically impossible, and that's anti-Semitic. Even if the Jews are a threat to every living Palestinian, we're still talking about a very small concentrated area of the world and a few 100,000 immigrants elsewhere. So Zionism is not a global threat. That's Nazi language. And they're just using the word Zion instead of Jew, or that's straight out of the protocols of the elders of Zionism. We need to fight capitalism, racism, and Zionism. Three global threats. It's nuts.
Yeah,
But I think that there's a, I think that, just to finish up here, I think that there is like, you can't wash away 2,000 years of hating a community just like that. It doesn't disappear, right? I mean, Western civilization or Christendom is premised in many respects on the hatred of the Jews as being, you know, the great Satan because they killed Jesus. It just doesn't vanish magically. And it survived modernization, even when the French declared all people are created free and equal. The Enlightenment, you could say, was a failure because we had the Holocaust. And now it's come back again in the form of using Israel as a stand-in for the Jews. That's my speech.
Yeah. You know, I think we have some international bodies who played a big hand in that. And, you know, in the perpetual victimization of certain groups of people and supported that financially and ideologically. And I think that's problematic and that we need to take a look at that. If we want to look at global things and global influences, that's where we need to take a look to. Why is why does UNRWA exist, for example? Why is it separate from all other refugee, you know, efforts? There's one devoted to this one area. And, you know, it just seems like we're looking in all the wrong places and we're not wanting to see the true problem and the true issues that are facing all of us. If we want to talk about globalism or things of that nature, it's not Zionism that is the problem in that respect, at least not from my perspective.
Yeah, it's a tiny country in the Middle East with
the only democracy
which does not control the American government. Okay,
right,
I mean,
right.
The whole claim that, you know, the Israel lobby is somehow pulling the strings in American foreign policy is just utterly absurd. Like, Bush did not invade Iraq because the Zionists told him to do it.
Right. And that's more conspiracy, right? We get into those conspiracy theories.
Well, JVP's big one, I'm sure, don't know if you saw their deadly exchange one, where, you know, they claim that American policing forces are going to be recruited to train in Israel and come back to racially profile and murder Black people, which is nuts, right?
See, again, that's Black Lives Matter mythology, you know, being advanced as well, once again. I don't know if you saw the organization as well. It's Black Lives for Palestine. So it all comes back to these same people and efforts and groups, and, you know, trying to hijack and just denigrate, you know, the rich history that Blacks and Jewish people have together in the civil rights movement and stuff. I was even told by my supervising dean when I was talking about equity and equality, she said, you know, we don't talk about equality. That's the past.
Right,
we don't do Martin Luther King and all that. We're past that. We're looking for justice for everyone right now. That's their perspective. So they want to just erase the past, erase, you know, the contributions that have taken place, erase the history, and have people in perpetual division and strife with each other. That is the aim of this. And I'm glad more people are starting to open their eyes and question more. And ask themselves, you know, like, why am I taking an American studies class and we're focusing on, you know, the conflict in the Middle East, or, you know, supporting our freedom fighter brothers and sisters? Like, what does that have to do with American studies? You know, I'm not learning anything about America from that, you know. So those are the things that I'm glad people are starting to push back on and say, this is ridiculous. You know, it sounds like one perspective is being advanced. Is there another way to view this? That was the work. And I think that's the work that needs to be continued in earnest.
What's indicative of the larger issue here with DEI as practiced is the fact that, like, okay, fine, there's a group fighting for Palestinians. Okay, fair enough. But why is it Blacks for Palestine? Why do they have to know that they are Black? Because they're propping themselves up as people who are victims and therefore they know better. about the liberation practices, and they have a legitimacy that, you know, whites for Palestine would not have, hence queers for Palestine, right? Even though they're throwing
Right.
from the roof across the Middle East, it doesn't seem to bother them very much.
Yes,
Can I ask a
yes.
follow-up question? Have you felt any racism yourself as African American, supporting Israel? You know, if they're trying to say, well, you're not black unless you're supporting Palestine. You know, in the same sense that Larry Elder was called by the LA Times, you know, the black face of white supremacy. Have you?
Yeah. Oh no, I was
You have that in your
called,
article. It's in there.
yeah, I was called a white supremacist. I was called a dirty Zionist.
A
The B word.
fake black person
Yeah.
or something like that. There was something.
Yes, the wrong kind of black,
Like
the
a
wrong
wrong
kind of black. Yeah.
Uh,
So, you know, even though all of those constructs in and of themselves, they're very racist. So these anti-racist people are, as you mentioned, Jared, you summarize it really well. They are racializing everything and advancing racism. That is what they are doing. At bottom line, when you say present discrimination is a remedy for past discrimination, it's malarkey. That's ridiculous. We're seeing the outcomes of it. Look at the turmoil that we're all in. These policies and the efforts that they've made, they don't work. It's actually harming the people that it purports to help. And not only that, it's sowing hatred. It's making relations between people and groups and each other, individuals, less likely to be positive, because we're constantly trying to find the gotcha, you know, or to out victimize or out oppress one another. We need to get back to the basics, you know, of understanding each other, of liberal values. And I don't mean liberal conservative, but I'm speaking more in terms of, you know, what are the foundations of critical thinking, intellectual humility, viewpoint diversity,
Absolutely.
you know, all of those things that are so key that used to be, I mean, it's still in the missions and visions of colleges. They're just not focusing on it because they've turned their full attention to this DEI thing instead.
And you see the hypocrisy. When you're criticized by the left as a black person, you're called a traitor and whatnot. So they are, you know, they're using racialisms, but they are targeting your ideas, so they claim. When a white person or a Jewish person with white skin criticizes Ilhan Omar for her anti-Semitic statements, and they are anti-Semitic quite often, you get accused, oh, you're a racist. You're just targeting her because she's a black female Muslim. It's like, no, why don't you read the sentence that she wrote, and why don't you hear my response to it? I would say the same thing if she were white, male, and Christian. There would be absolutely no difference in my response.
Yeah, but they can't attack the merit of your argument or the content of it. So they use stoppers, like thought stoppers is what I call them. You're a racist, you're a transphobe, you're a this or a that, you know, that you get accused of something, and then that shuts you down intellectually, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm being accused of a racist. I'm not a racist. And then you start trying to defend that instead of focusing on the issue, which was the anti-Semitism, or in some cases, the plagiarism, or, you know, other things of that nature that are the real issues. It's a distractor for everyone. And I'm so glad to see people start waking up and say, you know, no, when you call me racist, I'm not even listening to that. You know, oh, I'm a transphobe. No, I'm not that. I'm focused on this issue. And here are the facts. Like, we have to keep bringing them back to the facts and not, I think who says it? James Lindsay. He says it's the Mott and Bailey approach, or some. It's some kind of philosophical thing that they do to bait people in and switch what's being talked about. So I'm glad to see that becoming mainstream. People,
and they're buzzwords. They know, oh, this person's a racist. Well, I'm not going to listen to him.
Then they talk about they want to see more black women have a voice. Well, you're a black woman, you have a voice, and they don't like what you say.
Right, right. Then I'm the wrong kind of black. And it's what's the right kind of black, you know? And then telling me, you know, I'm a white supremacist because I focused on setting an agenda for our meetings and being on time. That's white supremacy? No, that's why are we giving that to white supremacy? Like, in the redefinition of white supremacy? Why? Why is that? You know, what are you saying about people of color? They're supposed to be not on time, not able to read, not focused on, you know, being objective. No, I can't accept that. I can't accept that for the future of humanity and like the future generations.
And it reinforces racial stereotypes. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. You know, I mean,
and I apologize that I have to jump off because I
no, that's true. No, really, yeah, I know we've gone a few minutes over your time limit, but this has been really this has been a really enlightening conversation. I've very much enjoyed hearing what you've had to say. And again, my own experience has been in the, minorities, in the admittedly, white universe I inhabit here in North Carolina. My own experiences with the students of color and all that is most of them think quite rationally and have not jumped on this obsession, this ideological obsession for creating this utopia based on racial classification. Yeah, so I think there's hope, and people like you need to get their voices heard. People who have higher degrees, are people of color, are female, and I hate to have to classify people here, but if we're going to
There
target
goes my check boxes.
hey, no, if we're going to target their system, we need people who could check off the boxes because they can't deny your authenticity. I mean, they have no way of doing that. It's impossible if we, use their terminology to fight them. But we will let you go. So thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been an absolutely terrific discussion. I think one of our best podcasts yet, and we look forward to following your work in the future, Lee. I hope, and I do think you have a very, very prosperous career ahead of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.